He had lived a lifetime and seen his fair share of men and women, but no one had eyes quite like hers. There was a frosty, pristine innocence in her gaze. He hadn't noticed it at first. Standing up high on that sturdy, heavy, old-fashioned wooden stool, he had said, "All set." She flicked the switch, and the yellow bulb bathed the room in a creamy, gentle glow. When he looked down, she was looking up. As their eyes met, a sound echoed in his chest, like the rustle of a white bird gliding across the surface of the water. From that day on, he constantly dreamed of her eyes. Yet, in passing, they still exchanged nothing more than a brief greeting. The day after he fixed her light, the girl came home from work holding a box of cookies, offering them as a thank you. They went back and forth, politely declining and insisting, until she finally blushed, lowered her head, and retreated to her room. Only then did Daniel realize they had never spoken so much to each other before. He took his time eating those cookies. Even when the last few grew stale and soft, he left them sitting there on the kitchen shelf. At night, smoking in the dark kitchen, he would trace the silhouette of that box and think, once again, of her striking eyes. She had a rather ordinary face. Almond eyes, a delicate, almost timid nose and mouth. She wasn't particularly beautiful. Her dress hung loosely from thin shoulder blades, making it seem as if the clothes were wearing her instead of the other way around. He had known many voluptuous, seductive women before. Women who pinched cigarettes between their fingers, sporting red nail polish, red cherry embers, and lips as blood-red and glamorous as phantoms. He knew his type, but these light, innocent eyes somehow left a heavy feeling in his chest. One day, the landlady was shouting at her door, Miss Wilson, I have no choice here. Rent is going up this month." Daniel listened through his door. It wasn't exactly eavesdropping. He just happened to be doing handstands by the entryway. His eyes caught a sliver of light spilling through the crack beneath the door. The girl, wearing pale blue flats, stepped out onto the threshold as softly as a kitten. He heard her ask in a tiny voice, "That's too expensive. Could you lower it a bit? Just a little." "Even a dozen eggs at the grocery store costs more now," the landlady said. "If you think it's too high, go ask around." Those little pale blue shoes shifted, the toes nervously drawing together. The landlady's dog kept barking. The girl seemed afraid of it, unconsciously stepping back inside. The little dog sniffed around, caught Daniel's scent, and trotted over to his door, barking incessantly. "Think it over, Miss Wilson. If you don't like it, you can move out," the landlady said impatiently, scooping up the dog and heading downstairs. The pale blue shoe stood in silence for a moment. Then, the toes pivoted 90 degrees, pointing directly at where Daniel's face was pressed against the wood. Startled, Daniel instinctively tried to duck away. His grip slipped, and he came crashing down onto the floor. A piercing pain shot through his wrist. When he looked up again, the shoes were gone. The hallway was empty, carrying a touch of winter's bleakness. She had merely turned around to go back inside. His hand was injured. He blamed himself for it, seeing the injury as a punishment for eavesdropping. That night, a sudden knocking echoed on his door. No one ever knocked on his door. He peered cautiously through the peephole. Standing dead center in the halo of twilight was the frail, slender Miss Wilson. "My light bulb broke. Could you please take a look for me?" she asked timidly. If she could turn back time, Nina wished she had never moved to such an isolated suburb. The previous Friday, she had worked late. It was Valentine's Day, and the senior staff in her department had left early for their dates, dumping all the unfinished work on her. Nina hadn't even had time to eat. After rushing through campaign copy and revising proposals, it was already 10:15 by the time she reached her apartment building. The early spring nights in Briarport brought a fine, misty rain. The air was warm and damp, the pavement slick, occasionally littered with the crushed petals of a discarded rose. Nina smiled self-deprecatingly, keeping her head down as she slowly climbed the stairs. Her body was completely numb from exhaustion. It was an old apartment building. The hallway lights were broken and no one ever fixed them, so she had to use her phone's flashlight. Just as she neared her door, the acrid stench of cigarette smoke hit her. Turning the corner, she saw glowing red embers. A group of rough-looking men were lounging on the dark stairwell, smoking. Nina felt her scalp prickle. She kept her head down, pretending to fish for her keys in her bag, though her palms were sweating and she was already gripping them tightly. Seeing her pause, the men showed absolutely no intention of moving. Instead, they stared down at her from their higher vantage point. Left with no choice, Nina steeled herself and continued up the stairs. She was wearing a tight, short wool skirt, which made squeezing past the seated men incredibly awkward. Just as expected, as she passed them, someone softly whistled. Even with her eyes closed, Nina could feel the suggestive smirks on their faces. Annoyed, she hurried up the remaining steps. But tonight, even her lock was working against her. The more anxious she felt, the more the key refused to turn. It was 10:30 at night. The whistling, the laughter of the men sitting on the floor, it all left Nina trapped in the dark, on the verge of tears. Right at that moment, the door next to hers violently swung open. A wave of dark golden light poured into the hallway, and standing in its glow was her next-door neighbor, the man who had changed her light bulb. The whistling stopped. The air went deathly quiet. Nina didn't dare look up, clutching her keys tightly. The man casually pulled his door shut, slung his jacket loosely over one shoulder, and walked right through the group of men, heading downstairs. The men immediately shrank back, quietly falling in line behind him as they left. Only after locking herself inside did Nina realize how hot she was. She touched her back. It was covered in a fine layer of cold sweat. When she first moved to Briarport for work after graduation, she chose the suburbs to save money. Her mother had vehemently opposed the idea, warning her that sketchy areas were full of shady characters and that it was dangerous for a girl living alone. Nina had never taken those warnings to heart, but tonight, her heart was pounding out of her chest. She had never known she lived next door to such a dangerous figure. To think she had even knocked on his door and invited him into her apartment to fix a light bulb. Nina blamed her own lack of vigilance. Whenever she occasionally bumped into him in the hallway after that, she pretended to be engrossed in her phone, never daring to greet him again. He looked so clean-cut, like a 20-year-old Keanu Reeves, with a pale, clear complexion and a smile that carried a hint of romantic, reckless ease. Who would have thought a guy like that was actually a street thug? Nina was just terrified. Unfortunately, she had just paid this month's rent. Breaking the lease abruptly would mean paying a penalty, and she couldn't bear to lose that money. How long had she been living there? Checking the calendar, she realized it had only been 3 months. Since nothing had happened in those 3 months, the next 3 should pass quickly enough. After that, she was definitely moving downtown. Tonight's encounter had just been a false alarm. The internet was full of daily reports about young single women being murdered. She never imagined that reality could be so close. It had been so dark that night, anything could have happened. She never wanted to experience something like that again for the rest of her life. 3 months later, she still didn't manage to move. The landlady had originally promised verbally that the deposit would be fully refunded after 6 months. But when Nina actually brought it up, the old woman acted like that conversation never happened, pointing out that the lease explicitly stated a 1-year term. If Miss Wilson wanted to leave, she was free to do so at any time, provided she forfeited her deposit. Her deposit amounted to 2 months' rent. To avoid throwing that money down the drain, she gritted her teeth and endured it. She never dared to work late again. If she had unfinished tasks, she would rather take them home or head into the office early the next morning. At first, the man next door still smiled at her as usual. But when he saw that Nina was ignoring him, he too grew quiet. The light bulb he had replaced glowed in her room every night, hanging there like an overripe persimmon in the void, threatening to drop from the ceiling at any second. Because she feared him, even the light began to feel dangerous. As the year drew to a close, everyone in the office was suffocating under the workload, and all the trivial tasks fell onto the shoulders of the new hires like Nina. One day, while Nina was working, the director's assistant came over to tell her that the colleague originally scheduled for a business trip had fallen ill, and Nina needed to pack her bags and fill in. As the gazes of several co-workers in her row darted her way, Nina lowered her head, desperately trying to suppress her wild joy. Attending the annual industry expo alongside the director was an opportunity a rookie wouldn't even dare dream of. Because she lived far away, she only had 2 hours to pack. When she hurried back to the apartment and stood before her door, She realized she had left her keys in her desk drawer at the office. Nina tried calling the landlady, but couldn't get through. The luggage was a secondary concern. The real problem was that her passport was locked inside her vanity drawer. How was she supposed to board a plane without a passport? As the minutes ticked by, Nina felt a sting in her nose, thinking about how incredibly hard she had worked to transition from an intern to a full-time employee. The residents in the hallway had already started cooking. The clattering of pot lids and the crackle of hot oil seeped through the cracks of the doors. When the aroma of food drifted over, Nina inexplicably thought of her mother. If only her mom were here, her mom could fix anything. It was all her own fault for insisting on leaving home to make it on her own. It was noon now, and the manager was leaving at 1. Why was she always making such a mess of things? Just as Nina crouched in front of her door, sobbing aloud, the door next to hers opened. The man looked as if he had just stepped out of the shower. His hair was dripping wet, and a snow-white towel hung around his neck. Looking back on it later, even Nina found it unbelievable. Crying in a daze, seeing him appear was like grasping at a lifeline. Dizzy and confused, she simply walked right into his apartment. "Want some water?" "I don't have anything else." He pulled an unopened bottle of water from the fridge. Seeing Nina shake her head, he unscrewed the cap and drank it himself. "I forgot my keys. Can I climb over from your side to get into my place?" Nina had swallowed cold air while crying, so she was hiccuping as she grabbed a stool and dragged it out to the balcony. Without waiting for the man's permission, she kicked off her high heels and prepared to climb over the railing. The man suddenly laughed. Nina found the sound deeply offensive and shot him a frustrated glare. But when she actually stood on the narrow concrete ledge and leaned out to look, she realized that most of her courage had quietly evaporated. "Come down," the man said. "I have to get over there, or I'll lose my job." Nina, her eyes red, refused to turn around, terrified that if she looked back, she would start bawling again. The man walked over, glanced outside, and said mildly, "6th floor, climbing a balcony in a pencil skirt. Not afraid to die, are you?" "I'm not afraid." Nina glanced down at the ground below, her mouth still stubborn, though her voice had grown significantly smaller. Before she could react, the man suddenly wrapped an arm around her waist and effortlessly lifted her down from the railing. "What do you need?" "My passport. Second drawer down on the left side of the vanity." He vaulted over with a light leap, moving so fast that Nina didn't even catch how he did it. 3 minutes later, he had already climbed back. The white plaster wall was covered in slick, damp moss. His expression was completely relaxed, yet Nina felt like her breathing had stopped. Her passport was clamped between his teeth. As she pulled the thin booklet from his lips, her fingers brushed against his soft mouth. A sudden jolt ran through her heart, like a box of fireworks bursting open. She found herself noticing the dark stubble on his jaw, his striking eyes, and his messy, damp hair. Even in the freezing weather, he was only wearing a white cotton tank top. The definition of his muscles showed faintly through the fabric, as handsome as a marble statue. Nina flushed. Acting as if nothing had happened, the man pulled the towel from his neck and went back to drying his hair. Nina suddenly felt her heart hammering. She quickly looked away. She had never stared so intently at a man for so long. Just as she was about to leave, the man called out to her. "Miss Wilson, if you're worried, you can always put a row of cacti on your side of the balcony next time." Her face burned red again. "Also, those guys from last time are my buddies from the construction site. Sorry they scared you, but they aren't bad guys." She felt her face was now as red as a ripe tomato. This guy really didn't know how to sugarcoat anything. My name is Nina Wilson." The girl hesitated for a moment before timidly holding out her hand. "Daniel Marsh." The man gave a barely perceptible smile and gently shook the small, pale hand offered to him. After the year-end performance reviews, the HR manager called Nina in for a chat. The very next day, she switched desks. While carrying her cardboard box upstairs, she walked past the pantry on her old floor and heard the whispering inside. It was supposed to be whispering, but the voices were unreasonably loud, filled with thinly veiled jabs, almost as if they wanted her to hear. The ones gossiping were the new hires who had joined the company alongside her. After Nina returned from the business trip with the director, the caliber of her project skyrocketed. Even the company's major West Coast client was transferred from a veteran employee to her. The veteran couldn't swallow the insult and resigned shortly after. When he left, his spot upstairs opened up, and the manager specifically requested Nina to fill it. Nina stood by the elevator holding her box. The mocking words felt like a dull knife dragging painfully across her heart. She recognized those voices. Back when they were all interns together, when Jess ran out of living expenses, it was Nina who frequently bought an extra lunch so they could share. When Nora's landlord unexpectedly decided to sell her house, it was Nina who took her in for 2 weeks while she looked for a new place. Even if others couldn't understand how hard she had worked to get to where she was today, to think that Jess and Nora were participating in this pantry gossip. Nina's stomach tightened, feeling as though she had swallowed a massive wad of moldy cotton. Naturally, her schedule cleared up. There were no more girlfriends asking her out for shopping or dinner. Her only conversation partner every day became the cashier at Kroger. Her phone screen remained perfectly clean, the notification bar as quiet as a new kind of loneliness. It was only then that Nina truly felt the profound isolation of being a stranger in a strange land. She tried browsing Amazon to kill time, but when she saw her credit card bill at the end of the month, her face turned grayer than her wallet. She then decided to mess around with recipes, banging pots and pans in the kitchen to produce a pile of charred, black messes, grateful only that she hadn't started a fire. The days dragged on. Now, aside from lounging in her wicker chair, soaking up the sun and reading, she didn't dare do much else. On those long spring afternoons, when she grew tired of reading, she would sometimes stand on her balcony and turn to look at the dividing wall. Years of monsoon seasons had left mottled patches of mildew on it. The sunlight refracted off the white plaster, creating a murky, ambiguous shimmer. Moved by a sudden impulse, Nina absent-mindedly pressed her palm against the wall. Her fingertips felt the cold surface, reminding her of the rough, icy texture of his fingers the day they first shook hands. She unconsciously let out a soft sigh. Thinking of him made Nina realize that she hadn't seen him in a long time. She had left in such a hurry for that business trip that she hadn't even had the chance to thank him. She had already given him cookies the first time. What would make a good gift this time? On the night Daniel returned from the Midwest, Briarport was suddenly engulfed by a late-spring cold front. The lingering warmth of the day vanished completely after dark, leaving the air crisp and dry. He was wearing a light, sleek black denim jacket. His head and hands were fully exposed to the sudden chill, making his skin look pale and composed. He seemed entirely indifferent to the temperature drop, his steps loose and unhurried, like a cat prowling across the rooftops in the night. He had excellent eyesight. Even from the stairwell, he noticed a subtle shift in the shadows and instantly went on high alert. One hand slipped toward his waist, his foot hovered over the next step, and even his breathing paused, becoming nearly inaudible. Hanging on his doorknob was a black plastic bag, its sharp corners poking through, creating a highly suspicious silhouette. It wasn't until he was sitting on his sofa that Daniel finally let out a wry chuckle. He didn't turn on the lights. Outside, Briarport was frozen in the chill of the night. Occasionally, a passing car would sweep its headlights through the window, filling the room with a brief, brilliant flash. When the car vanished around the corner, the light on Daniel's face faded back into darkness. Clasped in his palm was a pig-shaped nightlight. The pig wore a tiny white tank top over its pink belly, its clumsy hooves holding up a star. The gift-giver's little inside joke made him laugh out loud. He always wore a white cotton tank top as his base layer. The next day, Daniel ran into Nina in the hallway. The girl had just gotten off work and was swinging a grapefruit in her hand. Daniel stood in his doorway, hands shoved in his pockets, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up high. He smiled and said, "Hey, next time you give a guy a present, at least wrap it a little better." Her face instantly burned red. Without even looking at him, she spun around and went into her apartment. A few seconds later, the door flew open again. She stormed out, visibly pouting, and smacked Daniel hard with the grapefruit. She couldn't remember who suggested it first, but soon after, Nina started crashing dinners at Daniel's place. He cooked black pepper veal fillet, French mussels in cream sauce, and Southeast Asian seafood laksa. Nina freeloaded for a month, and her waistline visibly expanded as a result. At first, she had felt embarrassed, and insisted on paying for her share of the groceries. Daniel, mid-meal, gave a faint smile. His long, knuckle-heavy fingers set down his knife and fork as he slowly pushed the money back to her. Nina felt an undeniable sense of absolute conviction radiating from him. Just looking at his posture and his expression, she knew implicitly that he was not someone who operated on mundane social pleasantries. Daniel never cooked Southern home-style dishes. Nina only asked about it once. That night, he was in the kitchen making pasta, and she noticed his back stiffen. "Did you know that when people cook, they leave their own distinct signature?" she asked. "What kind of signature?" He just smiled and didn't answer. April 1st fell on a weekend. Nina came over for dinner and found that the menu was entirely seafood. A haphazard array of plates covered the table, and he had opened a bottle of white wine. Daniel cooked with the skill of a private chef, and the wine was excellent. Nina ate without a shred of dignity. Daniel, on the other hand, ate very little. He just kept looking at her with a smile, asking if she was enjoying the food. Patting her stomach as she sat at the table, Nina felt there was no greater satisfaction in the world. She let out a sigh and said, "If only life could be like this until the day I die." Hearing this, Daniel stood up. His apartment was utterly sparse. The one-bedroom layout featured a living room that held nothing but a raw wood dining table and 2 chairs. He walked over and turned off the lights. Nina was startled at first, but then she relaxed. In the dark of the night, a pair of hands gently pulled her up by the shoulders from behind. Guided by his hands, she stood, and they began to dance in the empty living room. At first, she was clumsy, constantly stepping on his feet, but soon he led her flawlessly. By now, she had gradually adjusted to the gloom of the room. The clamor of the street outside, the bleeding neon, and the dim, yellow glow of the street lamps filtered through the window. A grid-like shadow of the window panes was cast onto the floor. Stepping within this shadow, they felt as though they were very close to the world, yet entirely detached from it. The lingering, unspoken intimacy between a man and a woman imbued every passing quarter hour with a deep, enduring tenderness. Daniel guided her in a slow spin through the shadows. There was no light, no music. Daniel smelled of the sharp, clean scent of soap powder. Nina's eyes suddenly grew damp, and she gently rested her head against his chest. Daniel suddenly murmured, "One winter, early in the morning during a heavy snow, I went to Hawthorne Park. There were no footprints anywhere. The white snow blanketed the oak branches, pure and clean. The sky was overcast, and it was still snowing. I looked up and realized that, in the air, the snow actually looked black. Tell me, is there really anything absolute in this world? Like black and white?" He spoke as if sleepwalking. She kept her eyes closed. "Next time it snows hard, let's go to Hawthorne Park together." "All right. Then it's a promise." In her hazy state, Nina felt a damp kiss land on her forehead. She was heavily intoxicated, yet she desperately wanted to open her eyes and look at Daniel, to see if he was truly holding her and dancing with her. When Nina woke up, she was already in her own bed. Her coat was hung on the rack, and her shoes had been wiped perfectly clean and set behind the door. A quilt covered her. The April sunlight streamed in, carrying a weary warmth upon first glance. Jolting awake, Nina reached for the alarm clock on her nightstand. It was already 3 in the afternoon. Her head was splitting. She got up and went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. Sitting on the stove she rarely used was a small clay pot. Lifting the lid revealed a simple, ordinary pot of corn grits. She didn't have to guess who made it. Nina smiled softly. Beside the stove, several items were laid out separately: pickled cucumbers, scrambled eggs, and a southern biscuit. This modest, simple meal brought a deeply soothing comfort to her hangover. Nina scooped the grits into a small bowl and cradled it in her hands, eating slowly. The moment the warm porridge hit her stomach, it was as if she remembered something. Daniel had made southern grits. He never cooked anything like this. Her chest tightened. Still wearing her slippers, she bolted for the door. The moment she threw the door open, it slammed into someone. Nina leaned out to look. It was the landlady. The older woman was standing in the hallway clutching a small purse, counting cash. Her back aching from the hit, she turned and glared fiercely at Nina. "Did you two plan this out together?" My lease says 1 full year. Where am I supposed to find a new tenant now? Find a new tenant? Stop pretending. You live right next door, and you don't even know your own boyfriend moved out? Kids these days. The landlady curled her lip, tugged her dog's leash, and headed downstairs. Remembering something, she turned back and added, "You'd better hurry. I'm charging you a daily rate starting the day after tomorrow." Nina felt completely hollowed out. The landlady's figure gradually disappeared down the stairwell, the dog's barking fading into the distance. Daniel's door was unlocked. Nina hesitated for a moment before turning the handle and stepping inside. She had eaten dinner in this apartment for a whole month. She had knocked on that very door, begging its owner to come out and change her light bulb. She had shared a songless dance with him in the unlit night. Now, there was still a dining table and 2 chairs. The bed was still in the bedroom, the quilt pulled back at one corner to reveal the soft white cotton sheets. A few of his black clothes still hung in the closet. A towel hung out to dry on the balcony. Nina walked over and touched it. It was still damp, as if its owner had just used it. She closed her eyes, and hot tears rolled down her face. For the first time, she realized that tears actually possessed heat. Checking out went very smoothly. She hadn't brought much luggage to begin with. Daniel had already paid her lease-breaking penalty when he left. She thought to herself, you didn't have to do that. But as the words formed in her mind, she remembered he was already gone. A new set of tenants quickly moved in next door, a young couple coming to Briarport to hustle for a better life. They noisily moved furniture, hung curtains, laughing and chatting, radiating a steady, everyday kind of security. As Nina clumsily dragged her suitcase downstairs, she looked back. This apartment building was just one of thousands of unremarkable shelters in the city of Briarport. People leave, the tea grows cold, and the next tenant moves in, starting their own cycle of joy and sorrow all over again. Whatever story the previous occupants had lived, no one would remember it. Dejectedly, she pulled her phone from her pocket, dialed a sequence of numbers, and said, "I'm back. Carter, beautiful work this time." Outside the airport, a man walked up and patted Rebecca Carter on the shoulder, smoothly taking her luggage and tossing it into the trunk. The girl was visibly exhausted, curling up in the back seat without a word. "What's wrong? You're usually chattering away, but you're drooping today." "Captain Wade, what's next?" "Your mission is to get some good rest. You're really something. Daniel Marsh has top-tier anti-reconnaissance skills. He slipped right through our fingers multiple times. You pulled off a massive win here. By the way, how did you figure out he was going to bolt?" "He cooks. The food carries a signature a person can't erase." "Oh." She opened her mouth to say something, but ultimately swallowed her words. An inexplicable, selfish urge rose in her heart. That simple, unadorned bowl of grits was a pure, warm sanctuary between her and him. Something that could never be spoken aloud. A person only exposes themselves entirely when faced with the one they love, and she had exploited that very exposure. Back at the precinct, Rebecca rightfully received a commendation. As the youngest female agent on the squad, she had gathered a massive amount of first-hand intelligence and criminal evidence on Daniel Marsh during her brief 10-month undercover stint. That weekend, the police chief came over for dinner. After a few rounds of drinks, he made no effort to hide his admiration for Rebecca. He said, "Old buddy, I've competed with you my whole life, but I've lost when it comes to the next generation. Your Rebecca completely outclassed my boy." Carter Sr. laughed proudly, calling out, "Come on, Rebecca, pour your uncle a drink." Corpus Christi hugged the Gulf. Summer sunlight poured over the city, blanketing everything in gold from sky to earth, and the air perpetually carried the warm, briny scent of ocean breezes. As Rebecca drove home from work, caught at a red light, she would drift into a daze, reminiscing about the days when she was Nina Wilson. The soft southern accents, the pastries and iced tea ubiquitous on the streets, the damp weather with its endless drizzle. It felt as if she were just about to unlock her door when she would turn her head and see the tall, lean Daniel leaning against the doorframe, hands shoved in his pockets, a crooked smile on his lips, calling her name. "Nina." "Yeah," she replied, suddenly snapping to reality. She realized she had somehow stepped on the gas pedal. A car rocketing out from the cross street slammed directly into her side. Before losing consciousness, her mind was surprisingly calm, devoid of any panic. She thought she might be dying. The numbness that started in her lower half was gradually creeping across her entire body. Yet, she wasn't afraid. After all, the identity of Nina Wilson had already vanished once before. It was never easy to get a good night's sleep in a hospital ward, but the department had specially arranged a private room for Rebecca. Located at the very end of the hallway, it was quiet and undisturbed. Tall southern oaks grew outside the window. Her dad forbade her mom from visiting, telling her instead that Rebecca had been sent out on another assignment, while he took it upon himself to deliver meals to the hospital 3 times a day. Rebecca's leg was now encased in a heavy plaster cast. Once the surgical anesthesia wore off, the pain was excruciating, but Rebecca never uttered a single groan. Carter Sr. sighed, thinking, "My daughter really has grown up. She's no longer that naive, sweet girl she used to be." Truth be told, when he sent Rebecca undercover in Briarport, there wasn't a moment his heart wasn't fraught with worry. Who would have guessed she would complete the mission flawlessly, only to nearly lose her life in a car crash upon returning to Corpus Christi? The department took the accident extremely seriously. A rigorous, multi-agency investigation confirmed it was not an act of retaliation from the criminal syndicate. The precinct psychiatrist emerged from her room and simply stated that Rebecca had cracked under intense psychological pressure and needed profound rest. Everyone assumed the Briarport case had drained her spirit, so no one casually dropped by to disturb her. The days dragged on. Summer in a coastal town felt like being pricked inch by needles plated in sunlight, leaving a person aching with loneliness. Twisting her slender, pale neck on the pillow, Rebecca felt nothing but sick of lying there. She begged her father to bring her some books, but Carter Sr., fearing reading would strain her mind, claimed he didn't know how to pick any out. Secretly, he fetched a paperback poetry anthology she had read as a child. This edition featured only 1 poem per page, complete with explanatory notes and illustrations on the back. A simplified version meant for children who hadn't even mastered the alphabet. Rebecca chuckled internally, and eventually used that poetry collection to kill the long hours. Once, she flipped to an old poem about the coastline. The word, Briarport, suddenly leapt off the page. Her chest seized. During the shift change, she secretly borrowed a pen and paper from a nurse, copied down that single line, folded it twice, and hid it under her pillow. Staying in the room was making her frantic. She wanted to go home. Carter Sr. said he was afraid her mother would cry if she saw her like this, coaxing her into temporary quiet. But after being hospitalized for so long, not a single colleague from the squad had come to visit. While eating, Rebecca constantly complained to her dad about how heartless they were. "Everyone is busy. Who has the time to visit?" Carter Sr. fed his daughter, carefully offering the ceramic spoon as if Rebecca had reverted to a 3-year-old toddler. "Do you remember when you were little? I went on assignment and was gone for over half a year. When I walked through the door covered in stubble, you called me uncle." Rebecca laughed. Of course she remembered. Her father always said that being a detective meant possessing the resolve to sacrifice your own happiness and the happiness of the ones you love. As dusk fell, the sky outside the window began to curdle. Dark, fast-rolling clouds surged from the distant ocean toward the small city. A nurse came in to change her dressings and took the opportunity to heat up the dinner box Carter Sr. had left on the nightstand. The weather forecast predicted severe thunderstorms and gale-force winds tonight. Carter Sr. had old injuries in his leg, so they had agreed at noon that he wouldn't come by. When the rain began to fall, Rebecca was lying in bed reading her poetry. Even with her eyes closed, she could hear the deafening roar of the thunder outside. The rain poured down like a waterfall, and the oak branches whipped wildly against the glass, evoking a sense of apocalyptic collapse. At some point, the window had blown open. The sky-blue curtains billowed like sails in the wind, and a frigid draft swept straight into the room. Rebecca's professional instincts flared. She opened her eyes. The room was completely empty. She turned her head away, refusing to look at the window. After a while, the wind gradually died down. She forced herself to stay perfectly still. In the absolute silence, she could almost hear the rainwater dripping from his clothes onto the floorboards. On his way over, He had thought constantly of those eyes. He had lived a lifetime and seen his fair share of men and women, but no one had eyes quite like hers. Pure and resolute, they always reminded him of a serene, beautiful snowy day. Years ago in the north, he had seen a white bird take flight from a frozen lake. Alone in the snow, it possessed a desolate beauty. He had narrowly escaped death that time, drifting through many places afterward. When he reached Briarport, he had once again seen that very same landscape within a person's eyes. Later, his covert stronghold in the west had been entirely uprooted by the police. Thankfully, his inherently paranoid nature led him to change his safe house at the last minute. Rushing back to Briarport, he knew someone had leaked his shipment volumes and whereabouts. But no one had been allowed that close to him. No one, except that white bird. Long time no see. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her hospital bed. The girl stared fixedly at him. He noticed the high alert in her eyes and simply said, mildly, "Don't be afraid." Then, he leaned over and adjusted the hospital bed to raise her up. Only after finishing this did he pull a stainless steel thermos from his raincoat. There was no bowl, so he made do with her water mug. Steaming hot grits poured thickly from the thermos. She noticed his hands, fresh wounds layered over old scars, rugged like the bark of an ancient tree. His hair was visibly longer, messy and unkempt. The black rubber raincoat looked heavily worn, and the collar of his cotton t-shirt gave off a sour, stale odor. He looked like a man who hadn't lived a quiet day in a very long time. A stray dog with nowhere to go. The phrase suddenly popped into Rebecca's mind. If her memory served her correctly, Daniel Marsh, hailing from Corpus Christi, was supposed to have been captured in a small town near Briarport in the early hours of April 2nd. She had returned to Corpus Christi right after, and then she had gotten into the car crash. She knew absolutely nothing more about his case. Outside the window, thunder roared and the storm raged. The two stared at each other in silence. There were clearly so many questions to ask, so many things to say, yet in this moment, in this place, neither knew where to begin. Daniel stood up, walked around to the foot of the bed, and read her nameplate. Nina, huh? He flicked the nameplate. His voice was exhausted and hoarse. She lowered her head in silence. He sighed and circled back to the side of the bed. As he handed her the porridge, he accidentally brushed her hand. She instantly recoiled. The second she pulled away, she regretted it, cautiously lifting her eyes to look at Daniel. But the man's face remained utterly impassive, showing not a single ripple of emotion. In her heart, she knew he was profoundly hurt. She took only 2 bites before saying she couldn't eat anymore. When Daniel reached out to take the mug, he naturally grabbed a tissue to barrier his hand before extending it. "I'm leaving. I came this time to give you." He pulled an object wrapped in a black plastic bag from the inner pocket of his raincoat. She tilted her face up to look at him. In a daze, it was as if they had returned to the moment they first met. Him standing on the old wooden stool saying, "All set." Her reaching over to flick the switch, the yellow light bathing the room in a gentle glow. Suddenly, she saw Daniel smile, even as a red, hellish focal point abruptly appeared dead center on his forehead. She clamped her hands over her ears, yet she still heard the dull, tearing thud of the bullet ripping through flesh and bone. The squad had guessed correctly. The most likely place the fugitive Daniel Marsh would show up was Rebecca's hospital room. The sniper withdrew from the opposite building, and the police cleared Daniel's body from the room with maximum efficiency. When Captain Wade walked in, he saw Rebecca drinking the porridge, her face buried in the mug. It was only when he stepped closer that he noticed the girl's shoulders were trembling slightly. "Rebecca, I'm sorry." So that meant, right from the moment they arranged this specific hospital room, it had been a trap set specifically to lure him in. She nodded to show she understood, but she still refused to lift her face from the mug. Her father had always told her that a detective needed the resolve to sacrifice their own happiness and the happiness of the ones they love. But he had never told her what kind of resolve was needed when a cop falls in love with a criminal. Wade handed the object wrapped in the black plastic bag to Rebecca. He explained that through the heavy rain, the sniper in the opposite building couldn't see clearly and thought Daniel was pulling a gun to exact revenge on her, which was why he had fired so hastily. But it made no difference, Wade added. Daniel Marsh was guilty of heinous crimes. Even if he stood trial, he would have been given the death penalty anyway. Rebecca didn't ask how long her teammates had been lying in ambush. She didn't ask why they hadn't told her about the operation. After Wade left, she opened the plastic bag, which had already been unwrapped and inspected. Only then did she see it was a shattered resin pig. The white tank top stretched over its chubby belly, the golden star on its hooves, and the little pig's face were all smashed beyond recognition. She didn't shed a single tear. Over the many, many nights that followed, Rebecca never dreamed of Daniel. She worked as usual, executing her missions. Life was so heavy. There were many things that never needed to be spoken aloud. Only once did she pass through Briarport. It was Thanksgiving, 10 years later. She had taken a rare vacation to accompany her parents on a trip to Charleston. In the early hours of the morning, Rebecca slipped out of the hotel and took a 2-hour cab ride to Briarport. Standing in Hawthorne Park as the sky faintly brightened, the white snow blanketed the oak branches, pure and serene, as if it had never witnessed any filth in the world. She said, "We made a promise. I'm here." She pulled a pair of black gloves from her pocket. 10 years ago, she had picked up these gloves from a certain someone's empty apartment in Briarport. She buried the gloves in Hawthorne Park. The snow fell harder and harder, until it was impossible to tell what was snow and what was tears. Or perhaps, in a dream lingering just before dawn, she looked up and saw him standing right there in the snow. A youthful face, looking like Keanu Reeves fresh off a bit part, carrying a boyish, reckless joy. He reached his hand out to her. This time, she did not pull away. Across the eternal air, it was as if she rested her hand on someone's shoulder, as if someone held her in their arms. And there, in the absolute silence of the snowy morning, they danced together, without a sound.